Good evening. Take a slow breath in and let it go. As the day slowly fades away and the world outside becomes quiet, let us sit together for a while. Tonight's story is gentle. History as we know it is supposed to be continuous. One civilization builds upon the ruins of another. Knowledge accumulates. Progress marches forward. We learn to farm, then we build cities, then we invent writing, then we create empires. A nice neat line from primitive to advanced, from cave paintings to cathedrals to skyscrapers, except that's not what actually happened. If you look closely at the historical record, really examine the evidence we have, you'll find something unsettling. There are gaps, enormous, unexplained gaps, centuries where thriving civilizations simply vanish from the archaeological record, periods where human progress doesn't just slow down, it stops completely. Sometimes it even goes backward. Advanced societies collapse overnight, and their descendants spend generations living in the ruins, unable to understand the technology their ancestors used. These aren't just missing pages in a history book. These are entire chapters torn out, whole epochs where we simply don't know what happened to millions of people. Where were they? What were they doing? How did they survive? And most disturbingly, why did so many of them fail to survive at all? The Bronze Age kingdoms of the Mediterranean didn't gradually decline. They disappeared within a single generation. The Western Roman Empire fell, and Europe plunged into centuries where people forgot how to build in stone. Entire cities in the Americas were abandoned, swallowed by jungle, their inhabitants scattering to places unknown. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of the largest urban cultures of the ancient world, vanished so completely that we still can't read their writing 1,500 years later. These are the shadows between history, the dark spaces where our timeline breaks down and the story stops making sense. Now, if you're using this video to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it's fascinating seeing Berlin at breakfast and Boston at bedtime, all at once. All of us wondering about the same mysteries. Here's what makes these gaps so compelling. We have physical evidence that these civilizations existed. We can see their ruins, their artifacts, sometimes even their mummified remains, but then suddenly the evidence just stops. It's like finding someone's diary with 50 pages ripped out right in the middle of the most important chapter. Take the archaeological record of the late Bronze Age. For centuries, we see evidence of trade networks spanning thousands of miles. Advanced metallurgy, sophisticated writing systems, diplomatic correspondence between kingdoms. Then, around 1200 BCE, almost all of it vanishes. Not just in one place, in dozens of places simultaneously across the Mediterranean and Near East. Cities burned, trade routes abandoned, writing systems forgotten. For the next 400 years, the historical record is almost completely dark. Or consider pre-dynastic Egypt. We know the Great Pyramids were built around 2500 BCE, but the civilization that built them must have spent centuries developing the knowledge, the mathematics, the organizational skills required for such monuments. Yet, when we look for evidence of that development period, we find almost nothing. It's as if the Egyptians went from small farming villages to perfectly engineered megastructures with barely any transition. These gaps aren't just puzzling, they're haunting because they remind us how fragile our own civilization might be, how quickly knowledge can be lost, how easily complexity can collapse into chaos, how close we always are to forgetting everything we think we know. Tonight, we're going to explore these shadows, the centuries that swallowed civilizations whole. We'll travel from the Eastern Mediterranean during its mysterious collapse to the European Dark Ages, where literacy itself nearly died out. We'll venture into the pre-Columbian Americas, where entire cultures rose and fell without leaving written records. We'll examine the Indus Valley, where a civilization of millions left behind cities, but no explanations. We'll trace the lost history of Sub-Saharan Africa, deliberately erased by those who came later. We'll follow the Pacific navigators who colonized thousands of islands, then vanished into oral tradition. We'll peer into the murky centuries before ancient Egypt became Egypt, and we'll end at the Younger Deuce 12,000 years ago, when global catastrophe may have erased civilizations we'll never know existed. There's something deeply calming about these mysteries. Unlike the chaos of current events, these puzzles have been waiting for thousands of years. They'll still be waiting tomorrow. There's no urgency, no deadline, just the quiet comfort of knowing that history is far stranger and more incomplete than we usually admit. So get comfortable, let the questions wash over you, and let's step together into the shadows. Between history where entire civilizations wait in the darkness hoping someone will remember they were here. Picture the Eastern Mediterranean in 12th and 25 BCE, was the peak of human civilization. The most interconnected, sophisticated, complex world humanity had ever created. The Egyptian New Kingdom ruled the Nile with monuments that would still be standing 3,000 years later. The Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia with ironclad armies and bureaucratic precision. Mycenaean Greece flourished with palaces full of gold, and warriors whose legends would echo through Homer's epics. The Minoans traded from their island, paradise of Crete. The Canaanites and their Phoenician descendants sailed the Mediterranean, connecting all these civilizations through networks of trade that stretched from Afghanistan to Spain. Cities like Ugarit, Atusa, Msini, and Payos were metropolises by ancient standards, some housing tens of thousands of people. They had sophisticated writing systems, complex administrative bureaucracies, specialized craftsmen, professional armies. They traded tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa. Their ships carried wine, olive oil, textiles, perfumes, weapons. Their diplomatic correspondence written in Odeon, the English of the Bronze Age world, shows a level of international relations that wouldn't be matched again for over 1,000 years. And then in the span of maybe 50 years, between 1200 and 1150 BCE, all of it collapsed. Not declined, not gradually transformed, collapsed. Cities burned, palaces were abandoned, trade networks shattered, writing systems disappeared, populations plummeted. The sophisticated international world of the late Bronze Age simply ceased to exist. This wasn't like the fall of Rome, which took centuries and left behind successor kingdoms that preserved elements of Roman culture. This was abrupt, catastrophic, and nearly universal across the Eastern Mediterranean. Within a single human lifetime, civilization went dark, and it stayed dark for 400 years. Here's what the archaeological record shows, and it's disturbing. Layer after layer of destruction across dozens of sites. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, burned so hot that limestone walls vitrified. The palace at Paios in Greece shows evidence of desperate fortification efforts just before it was destroyed. Ugarit, one of the great trading cities of the ancient world, was so thoroughly demolished that it was never rebuilt. The palace at Knossos in Crete, center of Minoan civilization, abandoned. Troy, level 7, destroyed. Megiddo in Canaan destroyed. Hazor destroyed. Ashkelon destroyed. The list goes on. More than 40 major settlements show evidence of violent destruction during this period, not spread out over centuries, concentrated in just a few decades around 1200 BCE. Something catastrophic swept through the Bronze Age world like a tsunami, smashing everything in its path. But here's what's really disturbing. We don't know what did it. Or more accurately, we have too many explanations and not enough evidence to choose between them. Because the Bronze Age collapse didn't just destroy cities, it destroyed the ability to record what happened. When writing systems disappeared, so did the historical accounts that could have told us what went wrong. The most famous theory involves the Sea Peoples. They appear in Egyptian records around 1200 BCE as a confederation of raiders and invaders coming from the islands in the midst of the sea. Pharaoh Ramesses III fought them in a massive naval battle around 1175 BCE and claimed victory, but even Egypt was weakened. His temple inscriptions described them as a terrifying force that had already destroyed the Hittite Empire and multiple other kingdoms before reaching Egypt's borders. But who were the Sea Peoples? The Egyptian records list names: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shachesh, the Denyen, the Wes. Some scholars think the Plisat became the Philistines. Maybe the Shachesh were Sicilians. The Denyen might have been Dans, the Greeks mentioned in Homer. But these are guesses based on similarities in names written in hieroglyphs 3,200 years ago. We don't know where they came from, what language they spoke, or even if they were a unified group, or just a convenient Egyptian label for those barbarian raiders from the north. More troubling still, We don't know if they caused the collapse or were a symptom of it. Because here's the thing about the sea peoples. They appear in the records after many of the major destructions Atusa burned before Ramesses III fought his great sea battle. The Mycenaean palaces were already destroyed or abandoned. So were the sea peoples destroying civilizations, or were they refugees from civilizations that had already collapsed for other reasons, desperately seeking new homes in a world falling apart? Some archaeologists think climate change was the real culprit. Paleoclimate data shows significant drought across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Tree ring studies from ancient timber show reduced growth. Pollen records indicate decreased rainfall. Lake levels dropped across the region. 4 Bronze Age civilizations that depended on agriculture to feed dense urban populations. Sustained drought could have been catastrophic. Crop failures would have led to famine. Famine would have caused social unrest. Desperate populations might have become raiders. Trade networks that depended on surplus production would have broken down. This makes sense until you realize that Bronze Age civilizations had dealt with droughts before. Egypt in particular had sophisticated systems for managing Nile floods and dealing with lean years. The theory of climate change as the sole cause doesn't explain the sheer speed and thoroughness of the collapse. Droughts cause gradual decline, not the sudden destruction layers we see in the archaeological record. Others point to systems collapse. The Bronze Age world was extraordinarily interconnected. Those trade networks that seemed like such strengths were also vulnerabilities. When you need tin from Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus to make bronze weapons and tools, you're dependent on stable trade routes across thousands of miles. When you've specialized your economy to produce wine and olive oil for export, you need to import grain. When your palace bureaucracy has grown so complex that it takes dozens of scribes just to track inventory, you're vulnerable to disruption. Think of it like a house of cards. Each civilization was supporting the others through trade, diplomatic marriages, military alliances. The whole structure was stable as long as every piece stayed in place. But if something knocked out one major player, the cascading effects could be devastating. If the Hittites fell, their trading partners lost access to critical resources. If trade routes became unsafe due to raiders, specialized economies collapsed. If one civilization's collapse sent refugees flooding into neighboring regions, it could destabilize them too. The complexity that had made Bronze Age civilization so impressive also made it incredibly fragile. The evidence for systems collapse is compelling. We can see it in the administrative records. The linear B-tabs from Mycenaean Greece baked in the fires that destroyed the palaces showed bureaucracies frantically trying to manage resources in what appeared to be crisis conditions. Allocations of bronze are measured to the gram. Conscriptions of rowers for ships suggest military emergencies. The last tablets from Pios mention coastal watchers as if they were expecting an attack from the sea. But then the tablets stop. Linear B, the writing system of Mycenaean Greece, disappeared completely. It wouldn't be redeciphered until 1952. 400 years, Greece had no writing system at all. The sophistication of palace administration, the careful record-keeping, the complex logistics that supported Mycenaean civilization, all gone. And not just gone temporarily. It gone so thoroughly that later Greeks had no memory that writing had even existed. When the Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet centuries later, they had to start from scratch. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so terrifying. It wasn't just political change, it was cultural regression on a massive scale. Population levels plummeted. Some estimates suggest Greece lost 80% of its population between 1200 and 1000 BCE. People abandoned cities and returned to small agricultural villages. Monumental architecture stopped. Pottery styles became simpler. Metallurgy techniques were lost. International trade ceased almost entirely. The world got smaller. The cosmopolitan Bronze Age civilization that has connected 3 continents was replaced by isolated villages that barely knew what existed beyond the next valley. The historical record shows this isolation. Egyptian pharaohs, who had once corresponded with kings across the known world, now dealt only with local concerns. The great diplomatic archives like the Amarna letters that show the Bronze Age world at its peak have no equivalence after 200 BCE, because there was no one left to write. 2. What's haunting is what was lost forever. We'll never know most of what Bronze Age civilization achieved because the collapse destroyed not just the civilizations themselves, but the records of their accomplishments. Libraries burned. Oral traditions were disrupted when populations scattered. Technologies were forgotten when the specialists who knew them died without passing on their knowledge. Consider writing the linear script of the Minoans. Still undeciphered, the Luwian hieroglyphs of Anatolia barely understood. Whatever writing systems existed in Mycenaean outposts around the Mediterranean, lost. Even in places where writing survived, like Egypt, the collapse created gaps. Egyptian chronology becomes fuzzy. The historical records are incomplete. We're missing pieces of the story that would help us understand what happened, and the collapse wasn't uniform. Some regions suffered more than others. Cyprus was devastated, but recovered relatively quickly. The Phoenician cities of the Levantine coast survived and even prospered, eventually expanding their trade networks westward to found Carthage. Egypt survived, though weakened, but the Hittite Empire disappeared entirely. Mycenaean civilization ended. The great cities of the Syrian coast were destroyed. For these regions, the Bronze Age didn't just end. It was erased so thoroughly that its very existence became legendary. The recovery, when it finally came, took centuries. Greece remained in its dark age until around 800 BC, when writing was reintroduced and population began to grow again. But the classical Greek civilization that emerged was fundamentally different from the Mycenaean civilization that preceded it. Different political systems, different religious practices, different economic organization. The Bronze Age palace economies, with their centralized control and bureaucratic complexity, were replaced by smaller city-states. Their great palaces were remembered only in legends about Agamemnon and the Trojan War, stories that later Greeks thought might be pure fiction, until archaeologists discovered that Troy and Mycenae were real places. What makes the Bronze Age collapse so relevant today is how modern our Bronze Age predecessors were in some ways. They lived in an interconnected global economy. They dealt with international diplomacy and trade disputes. They managed complex supply chains. They built civilizations that seemed permanent, that had lasted for centuries. And then it all fell apart so quickly that the survivors couldn't fully explain what had happened. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. We still don't know the primary. Because was it the sea peoples, climate change, systems collapse, earthquake storms, new weapons technology that made the old military systems obsolete? A combination of all these factors. The academic debates continue because the evidence is ambiguous. Different regions show different patterns of destruction and abandonment. Some sites show evidence of earthquake damage. Others were clearly burned in military attacks. Still others seem to have been abandoned without violence, as if the population simply left. What we do know is that when multiple stresses hit simultaneously, even sophisticated civilizations can fail catastrophically. The Bronze Age world might have survived drought or raiders or political instability, but all of them together, cascading through interconnected systems, were too much. The House of Cards collapsed, and when it did, humanity lost 400 years. For centuries, during which populations declined, technologies were forgotten, writing disappeared, trade networks shattered. 4 centuries of regression during which the descendants of Bronze Age civilization struggled to survive in a darker, smaller, more dangerous world. 4 centuries of history that left almost no written record. Just destruction layers in the archaeological evidence and legends passed down through oral tradition. The Bronze Age collapse is a reminder that civilization is more fragile than we think, that complexity creates vulnerability as well as strength, that the sophisticated systems we build to connect us can also cascade our failures, and that sometimes, despite our best efforts to record and preserve, whole eras of human achievement can simply vanish, leaving only ruins and mysteries for future generations to puzzle over. When the lights came back on, when Greece emerged from its dark age and writing returned and civilization rebuilt itself, the world was fundamentally changed. The Bronze Age was gone, and with it went knowledge, technologies, and historical records that will never recover. Somewhere in those lost centuries lie answers to questions we can't even formulate anymore. Stories that'll never be told, achievements that'll never be celebrated. All gone dark in the span of a single human lifetime, lost in the shadows. Between history, picture this. Rome, for 76 CE, the greatest empire the Western world had ever seen, simply stops. Not with a bang, not with some apocalyptic battle, but with a whimper. The last Western Roman emperor, a teenage boy with the ironic name Romulus Augustulus, is pensioned off by a Germanic general. And just like that, 5 centuries of Roman dominance come to an end. But here's what makes this moment so strange. The cities are still standing. The roads are still there, stretching across Europe like a massive stone spider. The aqueducts still carry water. The libraries still hold thousands of scrolls. Everything is there except the people who knew how to maintain it all, except the bureaucracy that held it together, except the literate class that could read the instructions. Within a generation, maybe 2, it all starts falling apart, not destroyed, just abandoned, forgotten. And for the next 500 to 600 years, Europe plunges into what we've come to call the Dark Ages. Except nobody at the time called it that. Nobody knew they were living in a dark age. They were just trying to survive. Now, here's the thing about the Dark Ages. The name itself is controversial. Modern historians hate it. They prefer early medieval period or late antiquity. And they have a point. The term Dark Ages was invented by Renaissance scholars who looked back at this period and saw nothing but ignorance and barbarism. They were comparing it to Rome at its height and finding it wanting. But that comparison isn't fair. It's like judging a forest that's regrowing after a wildfire and calling it dark because it's not as tall as it used to be. But there's another reason the term fits, a reason that has nothing to do with judgment. These centuries are literally dark to us. We can barely see into them. The written record doesn't just decline, it almost vanishes. In some regions, we go from hundreds of documents per decade to maybe 1 or 2 per century. Archaeological evidence becomes sparse and ambiguous. The material culture becomes so simplified that it's hard to date sites accurately. We're not just looking at a period of decline. We're looking at a period where our ability to see what was happening almost completely breaks down. It's like someone turned off the lights in history's archive. So, what actually happened? How does the most documented, most bureaucratic, most literate civilization in the Western world simply forget how to read and write within a few generations? The short answer is that the infrastructure of literacy collapsed. But the long answer is so much more interesting and so much more terrifying. Rome wasn't just an empire, it was a machine, a vast interconnected system where every part depended on every other part. The cities depended on grain from North Africa. The army depended on taxes from the cities. The roads depended on maintenance crews paid by the army. The whole thing worked because of constant movement. Goods flowing, people traveling, information spreading. When Rome fell, the machine didn't just stop. It started running in reverse. The cities that depended on imported grain began to shrink. As they shrank, they generated less tax revenue. With less revenue, roads couldn't be maintained. With roads crumbling, trade became harder. With trade declining, cities shrank further. It was a death spiral, and it happened fast. Within 100 years of Rome's fall, most major European cities had lost 80 to 90% of their population. Not because people were dying, though plenty were, but because urban life became impossible. When you can't get grain shipments and you can't maintain aqueducts, you move to the countryside where you can grow your own food and drink from wells. And when people moved out the cities, literacy went with them. Because here's what most people don't understand about literacy in the ancient world. It wasn't valuable for its own sake. You didn't learn to read and write because knowledge was important. You learned because you needed those skills for specific jobs. Government administration, tax collection, trade negotiations, legal contracts. All urban professions, all dependent on a functioning economy. In the countryside, literacy was useless. Worse than useless, it was a waste of time. Why spend years learning to read Latin when you could be learning to farm, to smith, to build? The practical skills that kept you alive didn't require reading, so people stopped teaching it. Within 2 generations, the children of illiterate Romans became illiterate farmers, and their children had no memory that literacy had ever been important. But it wasn't just literacy that vanished, it was technical knowledge of all kinds. How to build stone bridges, how to make concrete, how to survey land accurately, how to construct multi-story buildings. All of this knowledge was written down, carefully documented in Roman technical manuals. But if you can't read the manuals, the knowledge might as well not exist. Archaeological evidence from this period is absolutely haunting. We find Roman buildings being abandoned, then slowly dismantle for building materials. We find villa sites that just stop showing any signs of occupation around 450 or 500 CE. We find layers of what archaeologists called dark earth in former Roman towns. Basically just accumulated garbage and decay covering the Roman remains. But here's where it gets really weird. The abandonment isn't uniform. Some regions descend into chaos quickly. Others maintain some level of organization for centuries. Britain, for example, seems to experience near total collapse. By 500 CE, British cities are abandoned. Pottery making, which had been a sophisticated industry, reverts to crude handmade vessels. Even basic stone construction seems to be forgotten. People are building in wood again, like their pre-Roman ancestors had. But in other places like Italy and parts of Gaul, there's continuity. Cities shrink but don't disappear. Literacy declines but doesn't vanish. Some level of trade continues. It's not uniform darkness. It's patchy, inconsistent, maddeningly hard to understand. And then there are the mysteries, the things we simply cannot explain. Take settlements. During the height of the Dark Ages, roughly 600 to 800 CE, we have archaeological evidence of thousands of small settlements across Europe, villages, hamlets, isolated farms, but we have almost no written records describing them. Who lived there? How were they organized? What did they believe? We can dig up their post holes and garbage pits, but we can't hear their voices. Some settlements show signs of careful planning, rectangular buildings aligned in rows, suggesting some form of central authority. Others seem almost random, buildings scattered without pattern. Some have evidence of trade goods from hundreds of miles away. Others seem completely isolated. It's like trying to understand modern society by examining only the trash we throw away. You can learn something, but you miss everything important. Then came the Vikings. Starting around 793 CE, with the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery, Scandinavian seafarers began ranging across Europe and beyond. And here's what's so frustrating. We know the Vikings were incredibly successful. They established trade networks from Baghdad to North America. They founded cities that still exist today. They developed sophisticated shipbuilding techniques that allowed them to cross oceans. But we don't really know how they did it. The Norse didn't start writing things down until they converted to Christianity centuries after their expansion began. Everything we know about early Viking society comes from archaeological evidence and much later sagas that are half legend, half history, and completely unreliable for dating or details. How did Norse society organize expeditions involving hundreds of men and dozens of ships? How did they navigate across open ocean without compasses? How did they maintain supply lines across thousands of miles? We have theories, educated guesses, but the truth is, we just don't know. The Vikings left us their artifacts, but not their manuals. The only place where knowledge was being systematically preserved was in monasteries. As the Roman world collapsed, the Christian Church became the last institution with the resources and motivation to maintain literacy. Monks copied manuscripts, laboriously reproducing ancient texts by hand. Everything we know about classical literature, we know because some medieval monk thought it was worth copying. But here's the tragedy. The monks were selective. They preserved what they thought was important, which meant religious texts and works by Christian authors got priority. Pagan literature, scientific treatises, technical manuals, huge swaths of ancient knowledge were simply left to decay. We know of hundreds of ancient texts that existed in the early medieval period but don't exist now. We have references to them in surviving documents, but the works themselves are gone and sometimes hours long, recounting genealogies, major events, cultural practices. In societies with strong oral traditions, Go could recite the names and deeds of rulers going back dozens of generations without missing a detail. The problem is that oral traditions don't survive societal collapse the way stone inscriptions do. When a civilization falls to war, disease, or environmental catastrophe, its libraries might burn, but archaeologists can still excavate the ruins, find the tablets, reconstruct the written records. But if they go without passing on their knowledge, if the cultural continuity gets broken, the history simply vanishes. No ruins to excavate, no artifacts to translate, just silence where there should be stories. This is exactly what happened across much of sub-Sahara and Africa. Not because these civilizations were less sophisticated, but because the catastrophes they faced were so complete that the chains of oral transmission and when European colonizers arrived, they weren't interested in preserving what remained. They were interested in claiming the continent had no history worth preserving at all. Take Great Zimbabwe. In the hills of southeastern Africa stands one of the most remarkable architectural achievements of the medieval world. The massive stone wall, some 36 feet high, built without mortar from perfectly fitted granite blocks. A complex of enclosures covering nearly 1,800 acres, featuring a conical tower, intricate passageways, and sophisticated drainage systems. At its peak around 1300 CE, this was the capital of a kingdom that controlled the gold trade between the African interior and coastal Swahili merchants, home to perhaps 18,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in medieval Africa. When European colonizers first encountered these ruins in the late 19th century, they couldn't believe Africans had built them. There had to be another explanation. They claimed the structures were Phoenician, built by King Solomon's miners, constructed by lost Arab traders. Anything except the obvious truth that indigenous African peoples had created a sophisticated stone-building civilization. This wasn't just racist dismissal, though it was certainly that. It was erasure by denying that local peoples could have built Great Zimbabwe. Colonizers justified erasing the oral histories that still existed, the traditions that could have told us who these builders were, how their society functioned, why they eventually abandoned this magnificent city. Instead of preserving and recording these accounts, colonial authorities actively suppressed them. The result is that even now, more than a century after archaeologists definitively proved Great Zimbabwe was built by indigenous Africans, we still don't know crucial details about the civilization that created it. We don't know the builder's name for their city. We don't know the titles of their rulers or the organization of their government. We have only fragments of their trading networks, hints of their religious practices, questions without answers about why such a powerful kingdom left no written records and eventually faded from prominence. The kingdom of Kush tells a similar story, but with an added layer of tragic irony. For over 1,000 years, from around 1070 CE 2350 CE, the Kushite civilization thrived along the Nile in what is now Sudan. At various times they conquered and ruled Egypt itself. Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty controlled one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world. They built pyramids, not copies of Egyptian designs, but their own distinctive style, steeper and more numerous. They developed their own writing systemic script, which we found on temples, tombs, and everyday objects. Here's the tragedy: we can't read it. Despite decades of effort by linguists and archaeologists, Meroic script remains largely undeciphered. We know it's not related to Egyptian hieroglyphs, though it borrowed some symbols. We can identify names and a few words, but full texts remain opaque, locked away by the simple fact that when the Kushite kingdom fell, apparently nobody survived who could teach the script's meanings to later generations. Think about what we've lost. Imagine if we couldn't read ancient Greek or Latin. Imagine if all of Roman history was a mystery. All of Greek philosophy lost because nobody remembered how to decode the letters. That's the situation with Kush. We have their monuments, their artifacts, their cities. We know they were sophisticated, powerful, culturally rich, but their own words, their own accounts of their history remain silent, a gap we may never be able to fill. The Knot culture presents an even more perplexing mystery. Starting around 1500 BCE in the Hos Plateau of what is now Nigeria, somebody began creating distinctive terracotta sculptures, elaborate human figures with stylized features, detailed hairstyles, ornate jewelry. These weren't crude figurines. There was sophisticated artwork showing technical mastery and consistent artistic traditions. More importantly, the Knot was smelting iron by 1000 BCE, making them among the earliest ironwork cultures in the world. They skipped the Bronze Age entirely, moving directly from stone tools to iron implements. This suggests either independent innovation, which would be remarkable, or contact with ironworking cultures from elsewhere, which would rewrite our understanding of ancient trade networks. But we don't know which. We don't know who the Knot were, what they called themselves, how their society was organized. We don't know if they had writing, though no examples have survived. We don't know their language, their mythology, their political structures. All we have are their remarkable sculptures scattered across a region that was later disrupted by migrations, state formations, and eventually colonial conquest. Whatever oral traditions might have preserved no history were lost in the turbulence of the following millennia. The pattern repeats across the continent. Medieval West African empires like Ghana, Mali, and Shanghai controlled trade networks spanning thousands of miles, amassed wealth that made them legendary even in distant Europe. The Mali Empire's ruler, Mansa Musa, famously crashed the gold market in Cairo during his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 by spending so lavishly that gold prices didn't recover for years. We know this happened because Arab scholars documented it. We have outside observers' accounts of these kingdoms' wealth and power, but internal records, the day-to-day functioning of these empires, the perspectives of their own historians, these are frustratingly fragmentary. We know the names of some rulers, the outlines of some wars and successions, but vast periods remain obscure, understood only through archaeological inference and the scattered accounts of foreign visitors. Part of this gap is natural historical loss, but part is deliberate destruction. When colonial powers carved up Africa in the late 19th century, they weren't interested in preserving indigenous historical traditions. They were interested in claiming that Africa had no history, no civilizations worth respecting, no accomplishments. That would complicate the narrative of European superiority. Libraries were burned, not accidentally but systematically. Oral historians were dismissed as unreliable, their carefully preserved traditions discarded as primitive mythology. Archaeological sites were looted for objects to fill European museums with no regard for context or preservation of knowledge. And perhaps most insidiously, African children were taught that their ancestors had no history. That civilization began when Europeans arrived, that anything impressive on the continent must have been built by outside influences, and the consequences of this erasure are still felt today. Entire centuries of African history remain shadowy, understood only through fragmentary evidence and archaeological guesswork. We know sophisticated societies existed. We can see their artifacts, their architecture, their influence on surrounding regions, but their stories, their own accounts of who they were and what they achieved, these are often lost. But here's where the story starts to turn hopeful. Because unlike some historical gaps where evidence simply doesn't exist anymore, much of African history isn't lost. It's just been ignored, dismissed, waiting to be properly studied and preserved. Recent decades have seen an explosion of archaeological work across sub-Saharan Africa, revealing complex societies that colonial-era scholarship claimed didn't exist. In southern Africa, excavations have uncovered extensive trade networks, dating back over 1,000 years, with goods from as far away as China and India showing up in local settlements. In West Africa, ancient cities like Jeno are rewriting our understanding of urban development, showing sophisticated city planning centuries before contact with Islamic or European civilizations. In East Africa, researchers are documenting the Swahili coastal cities that mediated trade between the African interior and the Indian Ocean world, creating a unique fusion culture that was neither purely African nor purely Arab, but something distinctive and sophisticated in its own right. And linguists are working with remaining oral traditions, carefully recording and analyzing the historical information they contain, cross-referencing with archaeological evidence to build more complete pictures of the past. Perhaps most importantly, there's growing recognition that the absence of written records doesn't mean the absence of history. Oral traditions, when properly studied and contextualized, can preserve remarkable amounts of accurate information across many generations. Archaeological evidence, from settlement patterns to artifacts to environmental data, can reconstruct societal structures even without The lost centuries of African history aren't necessarily lost forever. They're just harder to access, requiring more careful work, more respect for different forms of historical preservation, more willingness to challenge old assumptions about what counts as legitimate historical evidence. As every year brings new discoveries, ancient cities emerging from jungle vegetation, genetic studies revealing unexpected migration patterns, linguistic analysis showing cultural connections nobody had suspected. The gaps are slowly being filled, not with speculation but with evidence, careful scholarship, and most importantly, African voices reclaiming their own histories. The story of Africa's lost centuries is ultimately a story about whose histories get preserved and whose get discarded, whose accounts matter and whose don't. For too long, the answer was determined by colonial power and racist assumptions. But that's changing. The silences are being broken. The gaps are being filled. And what's emerging is a picture of human history far richer and more complex than the simple narratives we inherited from an earlier, more prejudiced era. Now, let's talk about the largest ocean on Earth and one of the most audacious human achievements in history. An achievement that for some reason we barely understand at all. The Pacific Ocean covers nearly 64 million square miles. That's roughly 1/3 of the entire Earth's surface. And scattered across this vast expanse are thousands of islands. Some are large, like New Zealand and Hawaii. Others are tiny specks of coral and volcanic rock barely visible from more than a few miles away. And here's what's remarkable. By about 1200 CE, nearly every inhabitable island in this enormous ocean had been discovered, settled, and colonized by people traveling in wooden canoes. No compasses, no sextants, no GPS, just outrigger canoes, knowledge of stars and currents, and an almost incomprehensible amount of courage. This was the Polynesian expansion, one of the greatest feats of exploration and navigation in human history, and we have almost no idea how they actually did it. Think about what we're talking about here. These weren't short coastal hops. Polynesian voyagers traveled thousands of miles across open ocean, locating islands that were sometimes less than 10 miles across, surrounded by hundreds or thousands of miles of empty water in every direction. The distance from Tahiti to Hawaii is about 2,600 meters. The distance from Tahiti to New Zealand is over 2,400 miles. And Easter Island, the most remote inhabited island on Earth, sits 1,200 meters from the nearest landmass. Yet, all of these places were found, settled, and connected by regular voyaging routes. How did they do it? We know some things. Polynesian navigators use sophisticated techniques called wave. They memorize the positions of hundreds of stars, understanding exactly which stars rose and set at specific points on the horizon, depending on latitude. They read wave patterns, recognizing how swells bent and reflected around distant islands that were still below the horizon. They watched birds, knowing that certain species only flew within a certain range of land. They paid attention to clouds, understanding how weather patterns changed near islands. They even tracked the path of bioluminescent organisms in the water, which could indicate the presence of channels and currents. But here's the problem. By the time European explorers arrived in the Pacific in the 1500s and 1600s, most of this knowledge was already being lost. The great age of Polynesian exploration had ended centuries earlier. The voyaging routes that had once connected islands across thousands of miles has been largely abandoned. The last major expansion, the settlement of New Zealand by the Maori, around 1300 CE, had happened 200 years before Europeans arrived. And in those intervening centuries, much of the detailed navigational knowledge had faded from living memory. What we know about traditional Polynesian navigation comes mostly from a handful of islands in Micronesia, where the traditions survived into the 20th century. Researchers in the 1960s and 70s worked with master navigators from places like the Caroline Islands, documenting their techniques and attempting to reconstruct the lost art of wafting. These efforts led to the construction of modern replicas of traditional voyaging canoes and successful experimental voyages across thousands of miles of ocean. But here's the thing. We still don't know if what survived in Micronesia is the same as what was used during the Great Polynesian Expansion 1,000 years earlier. We don't know how complete our knowledge is. We don't know what we've lost. And that's just the navigation. The mysteries get even deeper when you look at specific islands and what happened there. Take Easter Island, Rapa Nui. This place has become almost mythical in popular culture. The massive stone heads, the moai, staring inland across the island. The story that is usually told goes like this. Polynesian voyagers arrived around 1200 CE. They found a pristine island covered in palm forests. They flourished for a few centuries, building those famous statues. But then they cut down all the trees, destroyed their environment, and their civilization collapsed into warfare and cannibalism. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, it's held up as a cautionary tale about environmental destruction, a civilization that destroyed itself through ecological mismanagement. But recent research suggests this story is at best incomplete and at worst completely wrong. First, the timeline of settlement keeps getting pushed back. Early estimates said 1200 CE, then 800 CE. Now some researchers think it might have been as early as 400 CE. That would mean the Rapa Nui civilization lasted over 1,000 years before European contact, not just a few centuries. Second, the environmental collapse narrative is being questioned. Yes, the palm forest disappeared, but new evidence suggests this might have been partly due to rats that arrived with the Polynesian settlers, not just human deforestation. The rats ate the palm nuts, preventing regeneration. Without the palms, the ecology changed, but it didn't necessarily collapse. Third, the warfare and cannibalism story comes almost entirely from European accounts written after European diseases had already devastated the island population. We're looking at society in collapse due to introduced diseases and literally making up stories about what happened before contact. What was Rapa Nui society actually like at its height? We don't really know. We know they carved and moved hundreds of massive stone statues, some weighing over 80 tons. We know they developed a unique writing system called Rangarongo, one of only a handful of independently invented writing systems in human history. We know they built sophisticated stone platforms called O and created an intricate rock art, but we don't know what their social structure looked like, how their economy functioned, or why they stopped making statues sometime in the 1600s. The details of their rise, their flourishing, and their transformation before European contact remain largely mysterious. And Easter Island isn't unique. Tiknan Mad. If you haven't heard of it, don't worry. Most people haven't. It's located on the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia and is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the Pacific, maybe the world. Nan Mo is sometimes called the Venice of the Pacific. It's a complex of artificial islands built on a coral reef lagoon. We're talking about 92 artificial islands, constructed from massive basalt columns and coral fill connected by a network of canals. The whole complex covers over 200 acres. Some of the basalt columns used in construction weigh up to 50 tons. And all of this was built without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, on a remote island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. When was it built? We think construction began around 1200 CE and continued until about 1500 CE. Who built it? The Sodala dynasty, apparently a ruling family that controlled Pohnpei and surrounding islands. Why was it built? Nobody really knows. The traditional explanation is that it was a ceremonial and administrative center, but the sheer scale of construction suggests something more. Some of the artificial islands were clearly residential. Others seem to have been ritual sites. One island contains structures that look like they might have been tombs. The whole complex is oriented according to astronomical alignments that we don't fully understand. And here's what's really weird. When European explorers first encountered Nan Madol in the 1820s, it was already abandoned. The local Pompans told the Europeans that the city had been deserted for generations, that nobody lived there anymore. The Sodala dynasty had fallen centuries earlier, overthrown by a legendary warrior named Isis. But the details of what happened, why the city was abandoned, what life was like when it was thriving, all of that was already lost to living memory. Modern archaeology at Nanmo has been limited. It's remote, difficult to access, and the site is rising sea levels are threatening the structures. But even in its ruined state, Nanmo raises profound questions. How did a relatively small island society mobilize the labor to build such a massive complex? Where did the engineering knowledge come from? And what happened to make them abandon it? These kinds of mysteries repeat across the Pacific. On Fiji, there are massive hill forts that speak to periods of intensive warfare. We know almost nothing. About Hong Tonga, there are enormous stone structures called langi that were royal tombs, but we don't know much about the dynasties that built them. On Samoa, there are star mounds whose purpose remains debated. And then there's the mystery that really challenges our understanding of Pacific history, the sweet potato. The sweet potato is a South American plant. It originated in the Andes, but when Europeans arrived in Polynesia, they found sweet potatoes already being grown across the Pacific from Hawaii to New Zealand. The Polynesian word for sweet potato, kumara, is remarkably similar to words for the plant in several South American languages, which means somehow there was contact between Polynesia and South America before European contact. Polynesians either reached South America or South Americans reached Polynesia, or both. Recent DNA evidence has confirmed this. Studies of modern Polynesian populations show small amounts of Native American ancestry dating to around 1200 CE, so contact definitely happened, but we have no historical record of it. No archaeological evidence of South American settlements in Polynesia, or Polynesian settlements in South America. Just the sweet potato. Some linguistic similarities in genetic traces. Did Polynesian voyagers reach South America, spend time there, and return with sweet potatoes and perhaps a few South American companions? Did South American mariners, perhaps from the sophisticated seafaring cultures of coastal Peru, venture west and reach Polynesian islands? We don't know. Both seem almost impossibly difficult, but we know one or both happened. This is what's so frustrating about Pacific history. We know that extraordinary things happened. We can see the evidence, but we don't know the details. We don't know the stories of the people involved, and much of what we've lost will never recover. Unlike in Egypt or Mesopotamia, where dry climates preserved written records, the humid tropical climate of most Pacific islands destroys organic materials quickly. There are no ancient Polynesian texts to discover, no lost libraries. What existed was oral tradition, stories and genealogies, and navigational instructions passed down through generations. Some of this survived into the modern era and has been recorded, but much was lost in the catastrophic population collapses that followed European contact. Diseases like measles, smallpox, and influenza devastated Pacific Island populations. Some islands lost 90% or more of their people within a generation of European contact. When you lose that many people that quickly, you lose knowledge holders. You lose the elders who remember the old stories, the navigators who know the traditional roots, the priests who understand the religious traditions. You lose centuries of accumulated wisdom in a single generation. Recent DNA studies are revealing just how much we missed. Genetic analysis of modern Pacific populations has uncovered evidence of migration patterns that don't match traditional theories. There seem to have been multiple waves of settlement, not just one. Some island populations show genetic contributions from groups we didn't know reached the Pacific. There are hints in the DNA of connections we never suspected, of journeys we never imagined. Linguistic studies are revealing similar complexities. Pacific languages form some of the most diverse language families on Earth, and the relationships between them tell stories of population movements, cultural exchanges, and isolations that we're only beginning to understand. Every few years, a new study reveals a connection nobody expected or questions an assumption that seemed certain. What emerges from all this research is a picture of the Pacific as a place of constant movement, innovation, and cultural exchange. Not isolated islands, but a vast network of maritime highways connecting thousands of communities across the world's largest ocean. A network that functioned for over 1,000 years before European contact disrupted it forever. But the details, the individual stories of discovery and settlement, of rise and fall, of innovation and adaptation, most of that is gone. We're left looking at ruins and artifacts, at genetic signatures and linguistic traces, trying to reconstruct a history that was already fading into legend. When the first Europeans arrived, the Pacific's forgotten voyagers accomplished something that rivals anything in human history. They explored and settled the largest ocean on Earth, using technology that seems primitive by modern standards, but represented the cutting edge of maritime innovation in its time. They developed navigation techniques sophisticated enough to cross thousands of miles of open ocean and reliably locate islands smaller than Manhattan. They created diverse and complex societies on some of the most remote and challenging environments on the planet, and we barely know their story. That's the gap. That's what we've lost. Picture yourself standing in front of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's 2550 BCE. You're watching thousands of workers moving massive limestone blocks with precision that seems impossible for the time. Engineers are calculating angles with stunning accuracy. Scribes are recording everything in elegant hieroglyphics. The entire operation runs like a well-oiled machine, coordinated across multiple construction sites, fed by a sophisticated agricultural system managed by a complex bureaucracy that extends up and down the Nile. Now, here's the thing that should make you pause. This pyramid, this incredible achievement of human engineering, it's not the beginning of Egyptian civilization. It's not even close. By the time the Great Pyramid was built, Egypt had already been a unified kingdom for over 400 years. The Egyptians who built it were looking back on their own ancient history, studying monuments their ancestors had constructed, reading texts that were already old. But if you try to trace Egyptian civilization backward before the pyramids, before the unified kingdom, you hit something strange, a gap. Not a complete absence of evidence, but something almost more puzzling. A transition so rapid it seems to violate everything we know about how civilizations develop. Around 3100 CE, Egypt explodes onto the historical stage as a fully formed complex society. Hieroglyphic writing appears. Monumental architecture begins. A sophisticated religious system emerges. Centralized government coalesces under the first pharaohs. All of this happening in what seems like the blink of an eye. Historically speaking, before that, scattered agricultural villages, simple pottery, basic tools, the kind of Neolithic culture you'd find in dozens of places around the ancient world. Nothing that obviously leads to pyramids and hieroglyphics. It's like watching someone go from elementary arithmetic to calculus in a single semester. The progression doesn't make sense. Something's missing. Archaeologists called a period before dynastic Egypt the predynastic era, and they've divided it into neat phases with names like Nicer Dut 2 and 3. But these labels hide more than they reveal, because what we're really looking at is one of the most puzzling transformations in human history compressed into just a few centuries. Let's start with what we know for certain. Around 5500 CE, people started settling along the Nile in permanent villages. They grew wheat and barley, herded cattle and goats, made simple pottery decorated with geometric patterns. These were successful communities, but there's nothing about them that screams future superpower. They're just Neolithic farmers doing what Neolithic farmers did everywhere. By 3100 CE, someone named Narma, also called Mensdra, unifies Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. He's wearing the double crown, wielding the power of life and death over millions of people. His scribes are recording his deeds in fully developed hieroglyphic writing. His architects are building massive mud brick structures that require coordinating thousands of workers. His priests are performing elaborate religious ceremonies in temples dedicated to a complex pantheon of gods. That's 2,400 years of development, sure. But most of the really dramatic changes happen in the last 400 years between about 3,500 and 3,100 BCE. And even then, the archaeological record makes it look like sudden jumps rather than smooth progression. Hieroglyphic writing is the perfect example. The earliest writing systems we know about, like Sumerian form, you can trace them developing over centuries. Simple pictographs becoming more abstract, counting marks evolving into frenetic symbols. You can literally watch writing in step by step. Egyptian hieroglyphics don't work like that. The earliest examples we have are already sophisticated. They're using phonetic elements, ideograms, and determinatives in complex combinations. It's not primitive writing figuring itself out. It's a mature system that appears almost fully formed around 3200 BCE. Some researchers think this means the Egyptians must have been developing writing earlier, but we just haven't found the evidence yet. Others point out that maybe the Egyptians got the idea of writing from Mesopotamia, where it appeared slightly earlier, but then rapidly developed their own completely different system. Both explanations have problems. If writing was developing earlier, where are the clumsy first attempts? Why don't we find practice inscriptions, experimental symbols, the inevitable mistakes that come with inventing something new? And if they borrowed the concept from Mesopotamia, why is Egyptian writing so completely different in form and structure? Why not more obvious parallels in the early stages? The architecture raises similar questions. The first pyramid, the Step Pyramid, at Saqqara, was built around 2650 BCE for the pharaoh Hosea. It's not a rough first attempt. It's a sophisticated structure showing advanced understanding of engineering, mathematics, and stonework. The architect, MP, didn't just stack stones. He created a complex with multiple levels, underground chambers, elaborate decorative elements. But here's what's strange. His Step Pyramid appears less than 500 years after the unification of Egypt. Before that, Egyptian architecture was mostly mud. The jump from mud brick buildings to massive stone pyramids is enormous. Not just in scale, but in the entire knowledge base required. You need to know how to quarry stone in massive blocks, how to transport those blocks, some weighing multiple tons across considerable distances, how to cut and fit them with precision, how to design structures that won't collapse under their own weight, how to organize and feed the workforce, how to maintain quality control across years or decades of construction. That's a lot of knowledge to develop in a few centuries, and the archaeological evidence for the intermediate steps is surprisingly thin. Some researchers have proposed that maybe there was an earlier sophisticated culture, something we're calling Dynasty Zero or the proto-dynastic period, that laid the groundwork for everything that followed. The evidence for this comes from a handful of shadowy figures who appear in fragments of king lists and on scattered artifacts. The most famous is the Scorpion King, known from a ceremonial mace head found at Himpilus. The mace head shows a ruler wearing what looks like an early version of the white crown of Upper Egypt, performing some kind of ritual. He's labeled with a scorpion symbol, but we don't know his real name, when exactly he ruled, or what he accomplished. Was he a real king who helped unify Egypt before Nama? Was he a local chieftain whose importance got exaggerated by later tradition? Was he a mythological figure who never existed at all? We don't know. The evidence is too fragmentary, but his existence, even as a possibility, suggests there might have been a more gradual development of Egyptian kingship than the sudden appearance of Nama would suggest. Maybe the unification wasn't a single dramatic event, but the culmination of generations of political consolidation that we can barely see in the archaeological record. Then there's Nabtuplia, and this is where the story gets really interesting. Nabtia is a dried lakebed in the Nubian desert about 500 meters south of Cairo. Today, it's completely inhospitable, one of the driest places on Earth, but between about 7,000 and 30,000 BCE, when the Sahara was greener and wetter, Nabtuplia was an oasis, a place where seasonal lakes formed during the monsoon rains. People gathered there, and they built something extraordinary. Around 5000 BCE, possibly earlier, someone arranged large stone slabs in a circular pattern at Nabtuplia. Not randomly, not as simple markers. These stones are aligned to astronomical events. Some researchers argue they track the summer solstice. Others suggest more complex astronomical relationships. The structure includes stone alignments that might have served as a primitive calendar, helping people predict the arrival of the monsoon rains. There are buried stones arranged in patterns that some researchers think might represent constellations. The whole complex suggests a level of astronomical knowledge and organizational capacity that shouldn't exist among small groups of Neolithic herders. Now, the interpretations of Nabtuplia are controversial. Some archaeologists think the astronomical alignments are overstated, that people are finding patterns that aren't really there. Others argue the structure is proof that the people of the Sahara were developing sophisticated knowledge systems thousands of years before dynastic Egypt emerged. But regardless of the specific interpretations, Nabtia tells us something important. The people living in what's now the Sahara Desert before it dried out completely, they weren't simple nomads waiting for civilization to happen. They were observing the sky, tracking celestial patterns, organizing communal labor for large construction projects, developing cosmological ideas, complex enough to encode in stone. And here's the critical connection. Around 3500 BCE, when the Sahara underwent its final desiccation, turning from savanna to desert, these people had to move. The climate was changing. The seasonal rains were failing. The lakes were drying up. The grasslands were turning to sand. They had two choices: die or migrate, and the nearest place with reliable water was the Nile Valley. So, what if the sudden sophistication of late pre-dynastic Egypt wasn't really sudden at all? What if it represents the arrival of people who'd been developing complex societies elsewhere in regions that now so arid and inhospitable that we've barely explored them? Archaeologically, what if the skills that built the pyramids, the knowledge that created hieroglyphics, the astronomical understanding that aligned temples and monuments, what if all of that was developed in the Green Sahara by people whose settlements are now buried under hundreds of feet of sand? The climate evidence supports this scenario. The final desiccation of the Sahara happened in pulses between about 5000 and 3000 BCE, with the most severe phase occurring right before the emergence of dynastic Egypt, exactly when you'd expect large-scale migration into the Nile Valley. The genetic evidence is more ambiguous but intriguing. Studies of ancient and modern Egyptian DNA show influences from across North and East Africa. suggesting multiple population movements converging on the Nile. The people who built dynastic Egypt weren't a single homogeneous group, but a mixture of populations with different origins. And the cultural evidence, the religious system of ancient Egypt, includes elements that seem to reference a homeland somewhere in the south and west, the direction of the now desert Sahara. Some of the oldest Egyptian myths talk about the primordial mound emerging from the waters of chaos, which sounds a lot like watching islands of land appear in seasonal lakes during times of drought. But here's what makes this theory both compelling and frustrating. If there was a sophisticated Saharan culture that migrated to Egypt and jump-started civilization there, we're probably never going to find direct proof. The Sahara is enormous, one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Archaeological survey is extremely difficult, and any settlements that existed would be buried under centuries of sand, scattered by wind, destroyed by the extreme temperature fluctuations that have been grinding away at the landscape for 5,000 years. We might be looking at one of those historical gaps that can never be completely filled. A lost chapter that we know must exist because the story doesn't make sense without it, but which remains tantalizingly out of reach. What we're left with is this: the Egyptian civilization didn't appear from nowhere. That's not how human societies work. People don't just spontaneously invent writing and architecture and complex government. These things have to develop, which means there must be a developmental period somewhere. We can see part of that development in the archaeological record of pre-dynastic Egypt, but it's not enough. There are too many gaps, too many sudden jumps, too many skills that seem to appear without the expected learning curve. Something else happened. Maybe multiple somethings. Maybe migrations we can't trace, maybe knowledge exchange with other early civilizations, maybe lost traditions developed in places that are now impossible to excavate. Or maybe, just maybe, the people of the ancient Nile Valley were simply more innovative, more adaptive, capable of rapid cultural evolution than we give them credit for. Maybe when the climate pushed them to develop quickly or die, they chose to develop, and they did it so successfully that we can barely believe it was possible. Either way, when you stand in front of those pyramids, you're looking at the result of a process we don't fully understand, a transition from simple villages to complex civilization that happened faster and more completely than almost anywhere else in the ancient world. The Pianastic Gap remains one of archaeology's most fascinating mysteries, and somewhere, buried under the sands of the Sahara or waiting to be discovered in some unexplored corner of Egypt, the missing pieces of the story are still waiting to be found. Picture this. You're a member of a thriving hunter-gatherer community 12,900 years ago. Your people have been flourishing for millennia. The Ice Age is finally ending. The glaciers have been retreating for 7,000 years. Temperatures are warming, sea levels are rising, and life is getting easier. Your ancestors learned to hunt megapora, to process wild grains, to build permanent structures. Some of your settlements have hundreds of people. You have trade networks stretching hundreds of miles. You're creating art, practicing astronomy, building monuments. You're on the verge of something big. Maybe agriculture, maybe cities, maybe writing. And then in the span of a single human lifetime, everything goes to hell. The change starts subtly. Colder winters, shorter summers. But within a generation, something unprecedented happens. The global climate doesn't just cool, it collapses. Temperatures plummet back to full glacial conditions. Not over thousands of years like they should, but over decades. The glaciers that have been retreating for 7,000 years suddenly surge forward again. Forests die. Grasslands become tundra. The megafauna you've been hunting for millennia start going extinct. Not just in one place, but everywhere. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears, all disappearing within a few centuries. Your settlements, the permanent villages your people have been building for generations, they become unsustainable. The food isn't there anymore. The herds are gone. The wild grain fields have failed. People are starving. Some groups try to migrate, looking for refuges that haven't been hit as hard. Others try to adapt to survive on whatever resources remain. Many fail. The archaeological record from this period shows a dramatic population collapse. Not 1,280 people like the ancient bottleneck, but still catastrophic. Cultures that have been flourishing for thousands of years simply vanish from the record. Their settlements abandoned, their tool traditions discontinued, their knowledge lost. This wasn't a myth. This wasn't speculation. This was the Younger Deuce, and it lasted for 1,300 years. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Before the Younger Deuce, during what archaeologists call the Alaurit period, humans weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The evidence from this time suggests societies far more sophisticated than we used to think possible for hunter-gatherers. Take the Narshevan culture of the Levant. These people were building permanent stone structures 15,000 years ago. Not temporary camps, but year-round villages with mortared walls, plastered floors, and storage facilities. They were harvesting wild grains so systematically that they developed specialized tools for it. Sickle blades with distinctive silica polish from cutting thousands of grain stalks, grinding stones for processing seeds into flour, storage pits for keeping surplus grain through the winter. They were doing everything agricultural societies do, except actually planting crops. They had achieved sedentary living through intensive foraging, and they weren't alone. In North America, the Clovis culture was thriving. Sophisticated big game hunters with a distinctive stone tool technology that shows up across the entire continent. They weren't random nomadic bands. They would organize mobile, capable of coordinating large-scale hunts and maintaining technological traditions across thousands of miles. In Europe, Magdalenian hunter-gatherers were creating cave art so sophisticated it wouldn't be matched for 10,000 years. The paintings at Lascaux, Alamera Chauvite, these aren't crude stick figures. They're dynamic, naturalistic depictions of animals, showing knowledge of perspective, motion, anatomy. The people creating this art had leisure time, specialized artists, complex symbolic systems. They had culture in every meaningful sense of the word. Then the Younger Deuce hit, and most of it disappeared, but some structures survived. And these structures are forcing us to completely rethink what we thought we knew about civilization. Gubsif in southeastern Turkey. When it was discovered in the 1990s, it broke archaeology. The site is 11,600 years old. That puts it right at the end of the Younger Deuce, before the invention of agriculture, before pottery, before settled civilization as we understand it. But it's not a simple settlement. It's a monumental complex of massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing 20 tons, arranged in circular enclosures and covered with intricate carvings of animals, abstract symbols, and human figures. Building this required coordinating hundreds of workers, quarrying limestone, moving massive blocks without wheels or draft animals, carving detailed reliefs with stone tools. This isn't what hunter-gatherers were supposed to be capable of. According to the old model, you need agriculture first, then surplus food, then specialized labor, then monumental architecture. But Quebec has it backwards. The monuments came first. The people who built it were still hunting gazelles and gathering wild plants. They hadn't invented agriculture yet. Or had they? Because here's the thing, Göbekli didn't appear out of nowhere. The construction techniques, the symbolic systems, the social organization required to build it, these things take time to develop, which generations at minimum, probably centuries, which means there had to be predecessors, earlier attempts, simpler structures, a gradual evolution of the skills and knowledge necessary to create something like Quebec. But where are they? If they existed before the Younger Deuce, most of the evidence would be buried under 1,300 years of climate catastrophe. Sites abandoned, structures collapsed, organic materials decomposed. And that's just the sites on land. Let's talk about sea levels. At the height of the last ice age, sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. That's a 40-story building worth of water locked up in glaciers. The coastlines looked completely different. What's now underwater continental shelf was dry land. Millions of square miles of habitable territory that humans would have occupied. And here's the thing about coastlines. They're prime real estate, rich in resources, moderate in climate, easy to travel along. If advanced hunter-gatherer societies existed before the Younger Dryas, they would have been concentrated on coastlines. And when the Ice Age ended, when sea levels rose those 400 feet over several thousand years, all those coastal settlements would have been inundated, their structures flooded, their artifacts scattered, their evidence erased. We've lost an entire world beneath the waves. This raises an uncomfortable question. How advanced were these lost coastal cultures? The standard model says they were hunter-gatherers, maybe complex hunter-gatherers, but still fundamentally primitive. But what if they weren't? What if some groups had developed technologies we don't expect? Sophisticated astronomy, advanced mathematics, early metallurgy. The knowledge would have been there. These people had the same brain capacity we do. They'd been refining survival skills for hundreds of thousands of years. They had thousands of years of relative stability before the younger deuce. Why wouldn't they innovate? This is where we enter controversial territory. Some researchers, Graham Hancock most prominently, have proposed that an advanced Ice Age civilization existed before the younger deuce. Not aliens, not Atlantis, but human. A culture that developed sophisticated technologies, possibly even maritime capabilities, that built monumental structures which mostly got destroyed by the climate catastrophe and subsequent flooding. The evidence they point to includes anomalous, megalithic structures worldwide. The massive blocks at Baalbek in Lebanon, some weighing over 800 tons. The precision stonework at Pumapunku in Bolivia. The underwater structures off the coast of Japan at Yonani. The submerged city ruins found off the coast of India near Dwarka. Mainstream archaeology dismisses most of these as either natural formations, misinterpreted as artificial structures, or as much younger than claimed, and they're probably right about most of them. But the dismissal feels a bit too easy sometimes, because we know for certain that sophisticated hunter-gatherer societies existed. Gublit proved it. We know that vast territories were submerged. By rising sea levels, we know that the younger deuce caused a catastrophic population collapse that would have destroyed most archaeological evidence, and we know that our ancestors were just as smart as we are. So, how can we be sure there wasn't more? Then there's the younger deuce impact hypothesis. This is the really controversial part. Some scientists have proposed that the sudden onset of the younger dusk wasn't caused by normal climate fluctuations, but by a cosmic impact. A comet or asteroid breaking up in the atmosphere and exploding over the ice sheets, causing immediate catastrophic cooling. The evidence they cite includes a thin layer of sediment from exactly 12,800 years ago that contains exotic materials. Nano-diamonds that only form under extreme temperatures and pressures. Magnetic spherules, suggesting massive fires. High concentrations of platinum group elements that are rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids. Shocked quartz crystals showing evidence of impact forces. Mainstream geologists are skeptical. They argue the evidence is ambiguous, that the materials could have other explanations, that no definitive impact crater from the right time period has been found. But the debate continues because if it happened, if a cosmic impact triggered the younger deuce, then any